The morning air in the small Polish village of Wilson carried the scent of freshly baked bread and wood smoke. It was September 1939, and life continued its familiar rhythm despite the unsettling rumors drifting in from the cities. 12-year-old Zofia knelt in her family's vegetable garden, her bare hands pressed firmly against the cool earth as she worked the soil around the potato plants. She couldn't hear the church bells ringing in the distance or the conversations of neighbors passing by, but she felt everything through the ground beneath her fingers. Zofia had been deaf since birth, living in a world of silence that others struggled to understand. But what they didn't know was that her silence had taught her to perceive the world differently. The earth spoke to her in vibrations, rhythms, and tremors that hearing people never noticed. She felt her mother's footsteps approaching from the house before she saw her shadow. She sensed when storms were coming hours before the first drops fell, feeling the distant thunder through the ground. The earth was her companion, her informant, her connection to everything around her. If you're enjoying this story, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible true stories from history. Her father, Tomasz, was a practical man who worked at the local mill. Her mother, Christina, taught Zofia to read lips and communicate through hand gestures they'd developed together as a family. Her older brother, Pavel, was protective and patient, always making sure she understood what was happening around her. They lived simply but contentedly in their small wooden house on the village edge, where the forest met the fields. That particular morning, as Zofia worked in the garden, something changed. A vibration unlike anything she'd felt before traveled through the earth. It wasn't the familiar rumble of a passing wagon or the rhythmic thud of horses. This was different, deeper, more ominous. It felt like a heartbeat, but massive and mechanical, coming from somewhere far to the west. She pressed her palms flat against the soil, closing her eyes to concentrate. The vibration was steady, growing imperceptibly stronger. It reminded her of the threshing machines at harvest time, but multiplied 100-fold, and it didn't stop. Zofia ran inside, her hands covered in dirt, and found her mother preparing lunch. She pulled at her mother's sleeve urgently, pointing toward the west, then pressed her hands together and made a rumbling motion. Christina wiped her hands on her apron and looked at her daughter with concern. Zofia tried to explain, using their gestures, that something big was coming, something that shook the ground. Christina went to the window and looked out at the peaceful afternoon. Birds flew overhead, and old Pan Kowalski was leading his cow down the dusty road. Everything seemed normal. She turned back to Zofia and touched her daughter's cheek gently, trying to reassure her that everything was fine. Perhaps she'd felt a tremor from the mill, or maybe her imagination was playing tricks. The adults had been tense lately, talking in hushed tones about politics and Germany, and children sensed these things. But Zofia knew what she'd felt. She went back outside and pressed her ear against a wooden post, then against the stone foundation of their house. The vibration was still there, constant and troubling. As the hours passed, it grew stronger. By evening, when her father returned from work, she tried again to warn him. Tomasz listened patiently as his daughter gestured frantically, pointing west, mimicking something large and heavy moving. Tomasz exchanged glances with his wife. The radio broadcast had been concerning lately. Germany had been making demands and tensions were high. But here in Wilson, life went on. The harvest needed to be brought in, the mill needed to operate, and children needed to be fed. He patted Zofia's shoulder and told her not to worry, though she couldn't hear his words. She saw the dismissal in his eyes and felt frustration building in her chest. That night, Zofia couldn't sleep. The vibration had grown from a distant tremor to a persistent rumble that she felt through her bed frame. She got up and pressed her hands against the wooden floor. It was unmistakable now, stronger and closer. She went to her parents' room and shook her mother awake. Christina, exhausted from the day's work, tried to comfort her daughter and guide her back to bed. But Zofia refused, pulling her mother to the window and pointing insistently toward the western horizon. The next morning, the vibration was even more pronounced. Zofia could feel it through her shoes as she walked. Other children in the village were playing, unaware, their games and laughter invisible to her, but obvious in their carefree movements. She approached Pan Kowalski, who was sitting on a bench near the village square, and tried to communicate her concerns. The old man smiled at her kindly, but didn't understand her urgent gestures. People in the village knew Zofia was deaf, and while they were generally kind, they often treated her as if her other senses were compromised as well. Pavel found her sitting alone near the church, her hands pressed against the stone steps. He sat beside her and waited patiently for her to look at him. When she did, he saw fear in her eyes. She took his hand and placed it firmly on the ground, holding it there. Pavel felt nothing at first, but his sister's intensity made him stay still and concentrate. After a long moment, he thought he detected something, a faint sensation that could have been his imagination. He didn't dismiss her this time. Pavel had always believed his sister perceived things others missed. He remembered when she'd sensed a minor earthquake that no one else had noticed until cracks appeared in the church wall days later. He stood and pulled her up, leading her home. Inside, he insisted their parents listen. Tomasz was preparing to leave for work, and Christina was packing his lunch. Pavel spoke with unusual firmness, telling them that Zofia had been feeling something for almost 2 days now, and perhaps they should pay attention. Tomasz sighed and agreed to check with some of the men at the mill. Perhaps someone had heard news from the cities. Perhaps there was something to the girl's concerns. He left, and Zofia felt a small measure of relief that at least her brother believed her. She spent the morning helping her mother with household tasks, but her attention kept returning to the vibrations beneath her feet. They were no longer subtle. They were a constant presence, like standing near a working engine. By midday, Tomasz returned home early, his face grave. The mill owner had received a telephone call from his brother in Lodz. German forces had crossed the border. War had begun. The information was still sparse, but refugees were starting to move east, and there were reports of tanks and mechanized divisions advancing rapidly through western Poland. The word Panzer was mentioned, German armored units that could cover vast distances quickly. Suddenly, Zofia's warnings took on new significance. What she'd been feeling for nearly 2 days wasn't imagination or natural phenomenon. It was an army approaching, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, all moving across the Polish landscape, their collective weight and power transmitting through the earth like a seismic wave. She'd sensed them before anyone in the village had received official word, before the tanks were even close enough to be heard by those who could hear. The village erupted into controlled chaos. Families began packing essentials, debating whether to flee or stay. Some believed the Polish army would stop the Germans. Others were less optimistic. Tomasz and Christina made the difficult decision to evacuate. They had relatives in a village further east, beyond the Bug River. It would be a difficult journey, especially with Zofia, but staying seemed more dangerous. As they prepared to leave, Zofia kept monitoring the vibrations. She indicated to Pavel that the source was getting much closer now. He trusted her completely. He helped his parents pack faster, urged them to take only what they could carry. Other families were starting to leave as well, carts and wagons forming a slow procession out of the village. The roads would be crowded, but everyone hoped to stay ahead of the advancing German forces. They left at dawn the next morning. Zofia looked back at their home, wondering if she'd ever see it again. The vibrations were now strong enough that even her parents could feel them if they stood still. A low rumble had become audible to hearing people, a distant thunder that didn't come from the sky. Fear was visible on every face they passed. Refugees from western villages were streaming eastward with stories of destruction and terror. The family joined the exodus, moving on foot since they had no wagon. Tomasz carried a heavy pack, Pavel another. Christina held Zofia's hand tightly, and they walked with determination. The roads were clogged with people, carts, livestock, and possessions. Progress was slow. Zofia felt the vibrations growing stronger with each passing hour. She pulled on her mother's arm, trying to communicate urgency. They needed to move faster. Whatever was coming was approaching rapidly. But the crowd moved at its own pace, and there was little a single family could do. As afternoon approached, Zofia felt a change in the vibrations. They became more distinct, more individual. It wasn't one massive rumble anymore, but multiple sources, spread out. She realized the German forces were no longer a distant mass, but had separated into different columns, and at least one was very close. She stopped walking and pressed her hand against a tree beside the road. The vibration was intense, almost painful. She grabbed Pavel's arm and pointed urgently to the south, off the main road. Pavel understood immediately. He spoke to their parents, suggesting they leave the main road and cut through the forest. It would be harder walking, but if German tanks were coming down the road, they needed to be elsewhere. Some other refugees overheard and thought it was a good idea. Others wanted to stay on the road, believing speed was more important than caution. Tomasz made the decision quickly. They would trust Zofia's senses. They left the road and entered the forest. The terrain was difficult, with roots and undergrowth slowing their progress. But Zofia felt some relief being off the open road. They pushed deeper into the trees, joined by 2 other families who'd decided to follow. The group moved as quietly as possible, helping each other over obstacles. Children were kept close and told to stay silent. Everyone's nerves were stretched thin. An hour later, they heard the first sounds of engines. Even Zofia, through the vibrations, could sense the change. The ground shook with a different intensity now. They were very close. Tomasz motioned for everyone to get down, to hide behind trees and bushes. The group crouched in silence, or as close to silence as frightened people could manage. Through the trees, they saw the road they'd left behind. Then they appeared. German Panzer tanks rolled down the road, their treads grinding against the dirt, their armored bodies imposing and terrifying. Trucks followed, filled with soldiers. Motorcycles with sidecars zipped between larger vehicles. The noise must have been deafening to those who could hear. Zofia felt it as an overwhelming assault of vibrations, each vehicle distinct in its signature. She pressed her hands over her chest, feeling her own heartbeat racing in contrast to the mechanical rhythms passing nearby. The German column had continued for what seemed like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes. When the last vehicle passed and the vibrations began to fade, the group remained hidden for a long time, afraid the slightest movement would bring disaster. Finally, Tomasz signaled that they should continue east, staying in the forest parallel to the road, but never on it. That night, they camped in a clearing, too exhausted to go further. No fire was lit. They ate cold food and tried to rest. Zofia sat with her back against a tree, her hands on the ground. The vibrations were still there, but moving away now, heading east and slightly north. Other columns were out there too. She could feel them, spread across the landscape like fingers of a grasping hand. She wondered how far they'd have to go to be safe. Pavel sat beside her, and she took his hand. In the darkness, he couldn't see her gestures well, but their connection didn't need perfect communication. He squeezed her hand, and she knew he was thanking her. Without her warning, they might have been on that road when the tanks came through. They might have been killed or captured. Her ability, the thing that had often made her feel isolated and different, had saved them. The journey east continued for days. They encountered other refugees with terrible stories. Villages had been bombed, people killed, homes destroyed. The Polish army was fighting, but being overwhelmed by the speed and power of the German advance. Hope was becoming a scarce commodity. Zofia's family reached her uncle's village, only to find he'd already evacuated further east. The village was nearly empty, with only the elderly and stubborn remaining. Tomasz made another difficult decision. They would continue east, perhaps all the way to the Romanian border if necessary. It meant leaving Poland, perhaps permanently, but it also meant survival. They rested for one night in the abandoned village, sleeping in her uncle's empty house. Zofia felt strange vibrations that evening, different from the tanks. These were sharper, coming from above. Her father explained that German planes were flying overhead, bombing strategic targets. The war was everywhere now, in the ground and in the sky. As they prepared to leave the next morning, something unexpected happened. Polish soldiers appeared, a small unit that had been separated from their main force. They were tired, hungry, and looking for information about German positions. The officer in charge, a young lieutenant named Wojciech, asked the villagers if they'd seen enemy forces. Most people could only give vague information, days old and unreliable. Pavel stepped forward and told the lieutenant about his sister. At first, Wojciech was skeptical, but Pavel insisted. He explained how Zofia had felt the German advance 2 days before it arrived, how she'd known which direction they were coming from, how she'd sensed them getting closer. The lieutenant looked at the young deaf girl with new interest. He knelt down to her level and spoke slowly, though she couldn't hear him. Pavel translated through gestures. Wojciech asked if she could feel anything now. Zofia closed her eyes and concentrated. She pointed northeast and indicated something large moving. Then she pointed southeast and showed something smaller, faster. The lieutenant consulted his map and his men. Those directions matched reports they'd received about German positions. He looked at Zofia with amazement and respect. He asked if she'd be willing to help them. They needed to avoid German forces while trying to rejoin Polish units further east. Her ability could be invaluable. Tomasz was torn. He wanted to get his family to safety, but he also understood the desperate situation. If the Polish army was going in the same direction they were, traveling together might be safer. Christina was less certain, worried about putting her daughter in danger. But Zofia, seeing the soldiers' exhausted faces and understanding the importance of what was being asked, nodded her agreement. She could help. She wanted to help. The arrangement was made. The soldiers would escort the refugees, and Zofia would periodically check for vibrations, alerting them to potential danger. It was an unusual partnership, but these were unusual times. The group moved east together, with Zofia walking near the front, stopping occasionally to press her hands against the ground or trees. She developed a simple system of gestures to communicate what she felt: distance, direction, size of force. The first full day of travel with the soldiers tested everyone's endurance. The group consisted of Lieutenant Wojciech and 7 soldiers, plus Zofia's family and 12 other refugees, including an elderly couple, a pregnant woman with her husband, and 2 young mothers with small children. The pace had to accommodate the slowest members, which frustrated some of the younger soldiers who wanted to move faster. But Wojciech was firm in his leadership. They would stay together as a group, or the entire arrangement was pointless. Zofia checked the ground every hour. She would kneel, press both palms flat against the earth, close her eyes, and concentrate for several minutes. The soldiers learned to recognize this routine and would halt the entire column when she needed to check. At first, some of the other refugees questioned why they were stopping for a deaf girl to touch the ground. Pavel explained patiently each time, and gradually people began to understand and respect what she was doing. On the second day, Zofia detected something that alarmed her. The vibrations from the northeast were different, Less organized than the German mechanized units, these felt more like individual horses, many of them moving irregularly. She tried to communicate this to Lieutenant Wojcik through her brother. The lieutenant's expression grew serious. Cavalry patrols, he explained, could be German reconnaissance units searching for Polish forces and refugees. They needed to be even more careful. He changed their route, taking the group deeper into forested areas where they'd be less visible from open terrain. The going became much harder. Mothers carried exhausted children, and the elderly couple struggled over fallen logs and through dense undergrowth. One of the soldiers, a young man named Jarek, who couldn't have been more than 19, helped carry supplies for the pregnant woman. His kindness reminded everyone that even in war, humanity persisted. That afternoon, Zofia suddenly stopped walking and grabbed Powell's arm with an urgency that made everyone freeze. She pointed to the northeast and made rapid, sharp gestures. The vibrations had changed dramatically. Whatever she'd sensed before was now much closer and moving faster. Lieutenant Wojcik immediately ordered everyone off the path and into dense brush. They barely had time to hide before a German cavalry patrol appeared, about 20 soldiers on horseback, moving through the forest slowly, searching. The group held absolutely still. One of the young children started to whimper, and his mother pressed him gently against her chest, stroking his hair, silently begging him to be quiet. Zofia watched the horse's legs through gaps in the bushes, feeling their hoofbeats through the ground. She could sense the pattern of their movement, the pauses as riders looked around, the acceleration when they moved forward again. She held up her hand, signaling everyone to remain motionless. The patrol was stopping frequently, and any movement could give them away. Minutes felt like hours. The German soldiers spoke to each other, their voices carrying through the forest, though Zofia couldn't hear them. She watched the faces of those around her, seeing fear and desperation. The pregnant woman looked pale, one hand protectively on her belly. The elderly man had his eyes closed, perhaps praying. Jarek had his hand on his rifle, ready if discovery was inevitable. Finally, after what must have been 20 minutes, Zofia felt the vibrations moving away. She waited longer, making sure, then slowly nodded to indicate it was safe. The group remained hidden for another 10 minutes before Lieutenant Wojcik gave the signal to move. When they finally stood, several people were shaking. The pregnant woman had tears streaming down her face. Everyone looked at Zofia with a new understanding. Her warning had saved them from capture or worse. As they continued east, the reality of their situation became clearer with each passing day. They encountered burned farmhouses and abandoned villages. Once, they found a small hamlet where all the inhabitants had fled, leaving behind possessions scattered in panic. The soldiers searched for usable supplies while the refugees rested. Zofia explored one of the houses, feeling the stillness that replaced what must have been a vibrant home. She found a child's doll lying on the floor and wondered what had happened to its owner. Food became a constant concern. The soldiers had some rations, but not enough for so many people. They foraged for berries and edible plants. One of the soldiers, an older man named Stefan who'd grown up on a farm, knew which mushrooms were safe to eat. The pregnant woman, whose name was Anya, grew weaker each day. Her husband, Marek, carried most of their belongings and tried to keep her spirits up, but worry was etched deeply into his face. On the fourth night, they made camp near a stream. The water was cold and clear, and everyone gratefully refilled their containers and washed the grime from their faces and hands. Zofia sat by the water's edge, her bare feet in the current, feeling the liquid vibrations. It was peaceful, a momentary escape from the constant tension of their journey. Pavel sat beside her, and they communicated through their private language of gestures and expressions. He told her that people were starting to call her their guardian angel. She shook her head, uncomfortable with such praise. She was just feeling what the earth told her. But Powell insisted it was more than that. Her gift, combined with her bravery and willingness to help, was extraordinary. She blushed and looked away, but she felt warmth in her chest. Despite everything terrible happening around them, she was making a difference. Lieutenant Wojcik approached and sat across from them. Through Powell's translation, he explained that they were about halfway to the Bug River. The journey was taking longer than he'd hoped because of the need to avoid German forces. He admitted that without Zofia's ability to detect enemy movements, they probably would have been captured or killed by now. He asked her if she was holding up all right, if the constant checking of vibrations was exhausting her. Zofia considered the question. Yes, she was tired. The concentration required to distinguish between different vibrations, to determine distance and direction, was mentally draining. But she also felt purpose. For the first time in her life, her deafness wasn't a barrier to be overcome. It was a tool, a skill, something valuable. She nodded and gestured that she could continue. She would not let them down. The next day brought new challenges. Zofia detected large vibrations from multiple directions. The German forces were spreading out, creating a network of patrols and checkpoints across the landscape. Wojciech consulted his map and realized they needed to cross an open area to reach the relative safety of a large forest on the other side. It was risky, but the alternatives were even more dangerous. They waited until twilight, when visibility would be reduced, but not completely gone. The group moved quickly across the open fields, everyone acutely aware of their exposure. Zofia felt vulnerable without trees or structures to press against for reading vibrations. She could only feel through her feet, which gave less detailed information. Halfway across, she detected something that made her heart race. Heavy vehicles, probably tanks, approaching from the south. She grabbed Powell and pointed urgently. He relayed the message to Wojciech, who immediately ordered everyone to run. They sprinted the remaining distance to the tree line, the elderly couple helped along by soldiers, children carried by parents. They reached the forest just as the sound of engines became audible to those who could hear. A column of German trucks appeared on a road they'd crossed just 10 minutes earlier. If they'd been any slower, they would have been seen. Inside the forest, the group collapsed in exhaustion. Several people were crying, overcome by fear and relief. Anya, the pregnant woman, was having contractions. Her husband held her, panic in his eyes. Christina, who had helped deliver babies in their village, examined her and determined it was false labor, likely brought on by stress and exertion. They needed to rest, truly rest, for at least a day. But Lieutenant Wojciech shook his head. German forces were too close. They had to keep moving. Compromise was reached. They would move for a few more hours to put distance between themselves and the German column, then find a secure location to rest properly. The group pushed on, every step an act of will. Zofia's feet hurt, blisters forming on her heels. She saw similar suffering on every face. War, she was learning, wasn't just about battles and explosions. It was also about exhaustion, hunger, and the simple act of putting one foot in front of the other when your body screamed to stop. They found a small ravine with an overhang that provided shelter. It wasn't comfortable, but it was hidden and defensible. The soldiers set up a watch rotation while everyone else tried to sleep. Zofia lay between her parents, her brother on her other side. Despite her exhaustion, sleep came slowly. She kept feeling phantom vibrations, her mind unable to fully disconnect from the constant vigilance. When she finally slept, her dreams were filled with mechanical rhythms and the sensation of the earth trembling beneath her. The next morning brought a small miracle. One of the soldiers had managed to trap a rabbit during his watch. It wasn't much meat split among so many people, but combined with some wild onions and the last of their bread, it made a stew that felt like a feast. Spirits lifted slightly. People talked more, shared stories from before the war, tried to remember what normal life felt like. Zofia watched their interactions, reading emotions from facial expressions and body language. Even in darkness, people searched for light. Her accuracy was remarkable. Twice she detected German units in time for the group to take alternate routes. Once she sensed aircraft before they appeared, giving everyone time to hide in tree cover. The soldiers began to rely on her completely, treating her warnings with the utmost seriousness. Lieutenant Wojciech told her she was as valuable as any scout, perhaps more so because she could detect things before they were visible or audible. The journey was hard. Food was scarce and everyone was exhausted. Several times they had to hide for hours while German forces passed nearby. The sounds of battle were often heard in the distance, and the smoke from burning towns darkened the horizons. Poland was falling, and everyone knew it, but they kept moving, kept surviving. Zofia felt the weight of responsibility. People were depending on her ability, trusting her perceptions. She couldn't afford to be wrong. One evening, as they camped near a river, Lieutenant Wojciech sat with Zofia and her family. Through Powell's translation, he told her that she had a gift, something special that had saved many lives. He said that in war, people often discovered strengths they didn't know they had. Her deafness, which others might see as a limitation, had become their greatest advantage. Zofia felt pride swell in her chest, but also sadness. She wished this gift could be used in peaceful times, not to escape death and destruction. They eventually reached the Bug River, which marked a boundary in the conflict due to the secret protocols of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Soviet forces were coming from the east, meeting the Germans in the middle. Poland was being divided between two totalitarian powers. The situation was becoming more complex and dangerous. Lieutenant Wojciech made the decision to try to reach Romania with his men. He offered to take Zofia's family with them. It was their best chance. The crossing into Romania was chaotic. Thousands of Polish soldiers and civilians were trying to enter, and the border was poorly controlled. In the confusion, the group managed to get through, though not without difficulty. On Romanian soil, they were technically safe from immediate combat, but they were also displaced persons in a foreign country with no resources and an uncertain future. The Romanian authorities set up refugee camps. Zofia's family found themselves in a crowded, muddy field with hundreds of other Polish refugees. Conditions were difficult, but they were alive. Lieutenant Wojciech and his men were processed separately as military personnel. Before they parted ways, he came to say goodbye to Zofia. He gave her a small Polish eagle pin from his uniform and told her, through Pavel, that she was a hero. She had saved not just her own family, but dozens of others. He hoped they would all see Poland free again someday. Life in the refugee camp was challenging. Resources were limited, and uncertainty about the future weighed heavily. But Zofia's family stayed together, and that was what mattered most. Tomasz found work helping to organize camp logistics. Christina helped care for sick children. Pavel assisted with translation, as he'd learned some Romanian. Zofia, meanwhile, became known among the refugees for her unique ability. People would come to her when they felt anxious, and she would check the ground and reassure them that no danger was approaching. The camp itself was a sprawling collection of tents and makeshift shelters that housed thousands of displaced Polish citizens. Mud was everywhere during rainy periods, and dust choked the air when it was dry. Privacy was non-existent. Families lived in spaces barely large enough to lie down, separated from neighbors by thin canvas walls. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Typhus, dysentery, and influenza moved through the population in waves. Christina worked tirelessly in the medical tent, helping overwhelmed doctors and nurses care for the sick. Zofia witnessed suffering on a scale she'd never imagined. Children her age who'd lost entire families, elderly people who'd survived the journey only to die from illness or heartbreak in the camp, young men frustrated by their inability to fight for their country, stuck in limbo while the war raged on. But she also witnessed remarkable resilience, people who refused to give up hope, families who shared their meager rations with those who had less, teachers who organized schools with no books or supplies, musicians who played instruments they'd carried across hundreds of miles, bringing moments of beauty to desperate circumstances. One person who became particularly important to Zofia was an older woman named Pani Kowalska, a former teacher from Warsaw. She'd lost her husband in the first weeks of the war and had no children. She took interest in Zofia, recognizing the girl's intelligence and potential. Pani Kowalska knew some basic sign language from having taught a deaf student years before. She began working with Zofia regularly, teaching her more advanced reading and writing, introducing her to literature and history, helping her understand the broader context of the war and Poland's place in it. Through Pani Kowalska, Zofia learned about other deaf people throughout history who'd accomplished remarkable things. She learned that her deafness didn't define her limitations, only required her to approach the world differently. The old teacher told her that the ability to sense vibrations as she did was extraordinary, something that combined her natural sensitivity with skills she'd developed out of necessity. She should be proud of who she was, not despite being deaf, but including all aspects of herself. Months passed. The war continued to rage across Europe. News filtered into the camp, rarely good. Poland remained occupied, divided between Germany and the Soviet Union. Many refugees despaired of ever returning home, but others held on to hope. They formed a small community, celebrated holidays together, tried to maintain their culture and identity in a foreign land. Zofia attended a makeshift school where a teacher who knew some sign language worked with her. She began to read and write more proficiently, finding new ways to communicate. Winter arrived, bringing new hardships. The tents provided little protection against the cold. Refugees huddled around small stoves, burning whatever fuel they could find. Frostbite and hypothermia added to the medical challenges. Food became even more scarce. The Romanian authorities did what they could, but they were overwhelmed by the sheer number of refugees. International aid organizations helped, but it was never enough. People lost weight, their faces becoming gaunt, their eyes hollow. Through it all, Zofia's family remained close. They ate meals together, shared stories before sleeping, supported each other through dark moments. Tomasz organized work details that helped maintain order in the camp. Christina's medical work saved lives. Pavel, now 17, matured rapidly under the weight of responsibility. And Zofia continued to provide her unique service, checking periodically for vibrations that might indicate danger, though increasingly the threat came from disease and despair rather than enemy forces. Her father told her one evening, as they sat outside their tent watching the sunset, that she had taught him an important lesson. He had initially dismissed her warnings because he didn't understand what she was telling him. He had let his own limitations, his inability to perceive what she perceived, cloud his judgment. He should have trusted her from the beginning. He apologized for not believing her sooner. Zofia hugged him tightly. She understood. The world wasn't built for people like her, and it was easy for others to overlook or dismiss what they couldn't experience themselves. As 1939 turned into 1940 and then into 1941, the war expanded. Germany invaded the Soviet Union, and suddenly the Germans, who had occupied Western Poland, were fighting the Soviets who occupied Eastern Poland. The world was chaos. But in the Romanian camp, Zofia's family persevered. They clung to hope, to each other, and to the belief that someday they would return home. Years later, after the war ended and Poland was liberated, though under a different kind of occupation, The family would eventually return to Wilson. Their house was damaged but standing. The mill where Tomasz had worked was destroyed. Many neighbors were gone, killed or displaced. The village was a shadow of what it had been, but it was still home. They rebuilt slowly, as did all of Poland. The scars of war, both visible and invisible, would take generations to heal. Zofia grew into a young woman in this post-war Poland. Her ability to sense vibrations remained, though she had fewer reasons to use it. She married a kind man who had also been deafened, though by the war rather than by birth. They understood each other in ways that went beyond words. She became a teacher at a school for deaf children, showing them that their differences were not limitations, but simply different ways of experiencing the world. She rarely spoke of those September days in 1939, when she felt the Panzers coming and nobody believed her. The memories were painful, tied to loss and displacement. But sometimes, when her students felt discouraged or isolated, she would tell them the story. She would explain how the very thing that made her different had saved lives. How being deaf had made her more attuned to the earth, more sensitive to vibrations that others missed. How trust and belief from loved ones had been as important as her own abilities. The war had taught her that survival often depended on seeing value in unexpected places, on listening even when there were no sounds to hear. Her brother Pavel, who became a doctor, would always credit his sister with teaching him to pay attention to what patients couldn't articulate. Her parents learned to value perception over convention. And the soldiers who had traveled with them never forgot the deaf girl who could sense danger before it arrived. In the end, Zofia's story became a small legend in Wilchen. The girl who felt the earth speak, who sensed the coming storm when everyone else was oblivious. It was a reminder that in times of crisis, salvation could come from the most unexpected sources, that the person others might overlook or underestimate could be the one who saves them all. That different didn't mean less, it often meant more, just in ways the world hadn't learned to recognize yet. The ground still spoke to Zofia throughout her life. She felt earthquakes before seismographs registered them. She sensed when the old mill was finally demolished, feeling its collapse through the earth. She noticed when new construction began in the village, the rhythm of machinery in progress. But never again did she feel anything like those Panzers in September 1939, the rolling thunder of approaching devastation. That particular vibration, thank God, belonged to the past, to a war that Poland had survived despite everything. And Zofia, the deaf girl who felt what others couldn't hear, had survived too, had helped others survive, and had gone on to live a full life, teaching others to trust their own unique ways of understanding the world.